Good evening, fellow survivors of the modern world. Tonight, we're about to embark on a journey that will make you grateful for every single convenience of your 21st century existence. We're traveling back 700 years to explore what it was truly like to live in a medieval village, not the romanticized fantasy of Hollywood films or storybooks, but the genuine, unvarnished reality of daily survival in an age where death lurked around every corner and life was, quite literally, nasty, brutish, and short. Picture this. You wake up before dawn to the sound of your own violent coughing, blood speckling the straw beneath your head. The air in your windowless hovel is thick with smoke from the dying fire, mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food scraps, and human waste that's been accumulating in the corner for weeks because nobody has invented proper sanitation yet. Your stomach gnaws at itself with hunger so constant you've forgotten what it feels like to be truly full. And as you stumble to your feet on the dirt floor, something wet and squishy squelches between your bare toes. You don't want to know what it is, but you can smell it. Before we dive deeper into the filth and fear, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is right now. Let's see how far this medieval misery travels across our modern, mercifully clean world. Welcome to your life as a medieval peasant, where every sunrise brings fresh horrors and every sunset might be your last. You are not a noble knight in shining armor or a fair maiden in a castle tower. You are one of the 90%, a serf, bound to the land like livestock, owned by a lord you'll rarely see but whose whims control every aspect of your wretched existence. Your world extends no further than a day's walk from the village where you were born, where you'll live your entire life, and where you'll almost certainly die. Probably before your 40th birthday, if you're exceptionally lucky. Let's begin. With your home, though calling it a home is generous, you live in what's essentially a one-room hovel made of whatever materials could be scrounged from the surrounding area. The walls are constructed from wattle and daub, thin wooden strips woven together and plastered with a mixture of mud, clay, animal dung, and straw. Yes, you live inside walls, literally made of shit. The roof, if you're fortunate, consists of thatch that leaks constantly, turning your floor into a muddy swamp during any rain. If you're less fortunate, it's just more branches and mud that collapse regularly, sometimes crushing whoever happens to be sleeping underneath. There are no windows because glass doesn't exist for people like you, and even if it did, you couldn't afford it. The only opening besides the door is a small hole in the roof to let smoke escape from your fire when the wind isn't blowing it back down into your lungs. The floor is packed earth, which sounds rustic and charming until you realize it becomes a cesspit of spilled food, bodily fluids, and the countless insects and rodents that call your home theirs as well. You share your living space not just with your family, but with your animals, chickens, goats, pigs, whatever livestock you're lucky enough to own, because bringing them inside is the only way to prevent theft and protect them from wolves and other predators that prowl the darkness outside. Privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. Your entire family, parents, children, grandparents, siblings, all sleep together in one room on straw mattresses that are breeding grounds for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and diseases you don't have names for. The straw is changed maybe once, or twice a year if you're prosperous, creating a festering environment where parasites thrive and illness spreads like wildfire. When someone in your family gets sick, everyone gets sick. When someone dies, their body might remain in the house for days before burial. because you can't afford a proper funeral and need to wait for the village to organize a mass grave. But let's talk about what you eat, or more accurately, what you desperately hope to eat. Your diet consists almost entirely of a grain porridge that's been watered down so much it's barely more nutritious than muddy water. On good days, you might have bread made from whatever grain is available: wheat, if you're incredibly lucky, but more likely barley, oats, or rye. The bread is often mixed with sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay to make the grain stretch further. It's frequently moldy because storing food without proper preservation methods means everything rots quickly. But you eat it anyway because the alternative is starvation. Meat is a fantasy reserved for feast days and the tables of the wealthy. Maybe once or twice a year you'll taste a bit of pork or beef, probably from an animal that died of disease and was distributed among the villagers before it completely spoiled. More commonly, you might catch a rat, a crow, or if you're very skilled and very lucky, a rabbit. Fish from the local streams are often contaminated with human and animal waste. But you eat them anyway because protein is protein, and beggars quite literally cannot be choosers. Vegetables are seasonal and scarce. In summer, you might have cabbage, onions, or turnips, but preserving them through winter is nearly impossible without proper storage. Salt is an expensive luxury, so most of your food is preserved by smoking, drying, or simply hoping it doesn't rot before you can consume it. Dairy products exist but are dangerous without pasteurization. Milk and cheese are breeding grounds for bacteria that cause tuberculosis, brucellosis, and countless other diseases that will kill you slowly and painfully. Water, the most basic necessity of life, is a constant source of terror. The village well, if there is one, is contaminated with runoff from human and animal waste. Rivers and streams serve as dumping grounds for garbage, dead animals, and human excrement. Most people drink ale or weak beer not because they're alcoholics, but because the fermentation process kills some of the bacteria that would otherwise cause dysentery, cholera, or typhoid fever. Even so, waterborne illnesses are common and frequently fatal, especially for children and the elderly. Speaking of children, let's discuss the absolute nightmare of medieval family life. If you're a woman, pregnancy is essentially a death sentence, waiting to happen, without any understanding of hygiene, anesthesia, or proper medical care. Childbirth is a terrifying ordeal where both mother and child frequently die. Midwives, well-meaning but ignorant of basic sanitation, often spread infection from one birth to another with dirty hands and contaminated tools. If you survive the birth, there's a 40% chance your child won't live to see their 5th birthday, succumbing to diseases like measles, smallpox, whooping cough, or simple malnutrition. Those children who do survive face a childhood that would be considered horrific abuse by modern standards. There's no concept of childhood as a protected, innocent period of life. Children work as soon as they're physically able, often by age 5 or 6. They're expected to contribute to the family's survival through labor, tending animals, gathering firewood, helping with harvests, or begging if necessary. Education is non-existent for peasant children. Literacy is reserved for the clergy and nobility, leaving the vast majority of the population unable to read, write, or even sign their own names. Child mortality shapes family dynamics in ways that are difficult for modern minds to comprehend. Parents often don't name their children until they're several years old because the likelihood of death is so high that emotional attachment becomes a luxury families can't afford. When children die, which they do with heartbreaking frequency, Their bodies are often buried in unmarked graves or simply disposed of without ceremony because proper burials cost money that desperate families don't have. But let's say you survive. Childhood congratulations, you've beaten terrible odds. Now you face the daily grind of adult peasant life, which is back-breaking labor from dawn to dusk with no hope of improvement or escape. Your work is determined entirely by the agricultural calendar and the demands of your feudal lord. During planting and harvest seasons, you might work 18-hour days with primitive tools that would be considered torture devices today. Plowing is done with wooden implements pulled by oxen if you're lucky, or by human labor if you're not. Your hands become permanent claws, gnarled and bleeding from constant work with rough tools. The feudal system ensures that you're essentially a slave. You cannot leave your lord's land without permission. You cannot marry without approval. You cannot learn a trade, start a business, or make any significant decisions about your own life. The majority of everything you produce, grain, livestock, crafted goods, belongs to your lord. You survive on whatever scraps remain after taxes, tithes to the church, and feudal obligations are met. Often, this means your family goes hungry, so that your betters can feast. Winter is a season of pure survival horror. Food stores run low or run out entirely, leading to what historians euphemistically call the hungry gap, the period between when last year's food is gone and this year's crops aren't ready yet. During these times, families resort to eating tree bark, grass, leather, and anything else that might provide even minimal nutrition. Starvation becomes a slow, agonizing process where the weakest family members, usually the elderly and very young, simply waste away over the course of weeks or months. The cold is another killer. Your home provides minimal protection from winter weather, and fuel for fires is expensive and scarce. Families huddle together for warmth, sharing body heat and breathing each other's diseased exhalations in close quarters that become breeding grounds for respiratory illnesses. Frostbite and hypothermia are common, leading to amputations performed without anesthesia using crude tools, if any medical attention is available at all. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the complete lack of medical knowledge or care. When you get sick, and you will get sick constantly, there's no help coming. The village might have someone who claims to be a healer, but their methods are based on superstition, folklore, and dangerous misconceptions about how the human body works. Treatments include bloodletting with dirty knives, applying poultices made from animal dung, drilling holes in skulls to release evil spirits, and consuming potions made from toxic plants. Diseases that are easily treatable today were automatic. Death sentences in medieval times. A simple cut could become infected and kill you through sepsis. Tooth decay, which everyone suffers from due to poor diet and no dental care, often leads to abscesses that spread infection to the brain. Broken bones are set incorrectly, if at all, leaving survivors permanently disabled and unable to work, which, in a subsistence economy, means a slow death from starvation. Epidemic diseases periodically sweep through villages like the wrath of God. Smallpox leaves survivors horribly scarred and often blind. Dysentery kills through dehydration and blood loss as victims literally shit themselves to death over the course of days. Tuberculosis causes a slow, wasting death where victims cough up blood and lung tissue for months before finally succumbing. And looming over everything is the constant threat of plague, the Black Death that would eventually kill 1/3 of Europe's population in a matter of years. The Church, supposedly a source of comfort and hope, instead adds another layer of terror to daily life. Medieval Christianity is obsessed with sin, damnation, and the constant threat of eternal torture in hell. Priests regularly deliver sermons describing in graphic detail the punishments awaiting sinners: being boiled in oil, having flesh torn from bones by demons, burning forever while remaining conscious to experience every moment of agony. These aren't metaphors or spiritual concepts. They're presented as literal descriptions of what awaits anyone who steps out of line. Sin is everywhere and impossible to avoid. Having sexual thoughts is a sign. Questioning church teachings is a sin. Working on the Sabbath is a sin, but so is letting your family starve. The church demands tithes, 10% of everything you produce, even when your family is facing starvation. Failure to pay results in excommunication, which means not only are you damned to hell, but you're also cut off from the only social services that exist. No one will trade with you, help you, or even acknowledge your existence. Superstition permeates every aspect of life, creating a world where logic and reason are constantly overwhelmed by fear and ignorance. Every misfortune is attributed to supernatural causes. Crop failures are blamed on witches, livestock deaths on evil spirits, human illnesses on demonic possession. This creates a culture of paranoia where neighbors turn against each other at the slightest provocation, searching for scapegoats to blame for their suffering, which hunts are sporadic but terrifying events where accusations can be made by anyone against anyone for any reason. Being accused of witchcraft is essentially a death sentence, because the methods used to determine guilt are designed to produce confessions regardless of innocence. Torture is routine and creative. Suspected witches are burned, stretched on racks, have their bones broken, or are subjected to water torture until they confess to whatever crimes their accusers demand. Even if you somehow prove your innocence, which is nearly impossible, the suspicion never goes away, and you'll spend the rest of your life under a cloud of fear and mistrust. The justice system, such as it is, operates on principles that would be laughable if they weren't so deadly. Trial by ordeal is common. Suspects are forced to carry red-hot iron bars, plunge their hands into boiling water, or undergo other tests based on the belief that God will protect the innocent from harm. Obviously, everyone is injured by these ordeals, which is then taken as proof of guilt. Trial by combat allows disputes to be settled through violence, operating on the assumption that God will grant victory to whoever is in the right, a system that heavily favors whoever is stronger, better armed, or more skilled at fighting, rather than whoever is actually telling the truth. Punishments for crimes are public spectacles designed to terrify the population into obedience. Theft might result in having your hand cut off. Adultery could lead to public flogging or being locked in stocks where the community is encouraged to throw garbage, excrement, and stones at the criminal. Murder is punished by hanging, but the process is deliberately slow and painful. Victims strangle slowly rather than having their necks broken quickly. Bodies are left hanging for days or weeks as warnings to others, rotting in public view and attracting carrion birds that feast while crowds watch. But let's talk about something that affects everyone regardless of their behavior: the simple, unavoidable horror of medieval hygiene. Bathing is rare and often considered dangerous or sinful. The Church teaches that cleanliness of the body can lead to spiritual corruption, and many people go months or even years without washing themselves thoroughly. When baths do occur, They're often communal affairs where multiple people use the same water, turning the experience into a festival of cross-contamination where diseases spread freely among participants. Clothing is worn until it literally falls apart, and when it's washed, which happens infrequently, it's done in the same contaminated water sources used for drinking and cooking. Fabrics are coarse and uncomfortable, often causing rashes and sores that become infected. Most people own only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, which means wearing the same garments day and night for weeks at a time, building up layers of sweat, dirt, and bodily fluids that create perfect environments for parasites. Lice, fleas, and other parasites are universal companions. Everyone has them, from the lowest peasant to the highest nobility. They carry diseases, cause constant itching and discomfort, and are impossible to eliminate without modern pest control methods. Scratching leads to open wounds that become infected, creating a cycle of illness and suffering that never ends. Body odor is so overwhelming and universal that it becomes part of the background of daily life, a constant assault on the senses that would be nauseating to anyone with modern standards of cleanliness. Dental hygiene is non-existent. Teeth rot and fall out regularly, leaving people unable to chew food properly and suffering from constant pain. Tooth extraction is performed without anesthesia using crude tools, often leading to infection, bleeding, and sometimes death. Bad breath is so common and severe that it's mentioned in medieval literature as a notable characteristic of human beings in general, not just those with particularly poor dental health. Personal waste disposal is a nightmare that affects entire communities. There are no sewage systems, so human excrement is either thrown directly into streets, dumped into rivers, or collected in pits near homes. Latrines, when they exist, are breeding grounds for disease that contaminate groundwater and attract flies and other disease-carrying insects. The smell is indescribable, a constant miasma of rotting waste that hangs over villages like a poisonous cloud. Privacy for bodily functions doesn't exist. Defecation and urination often happen wherever convenient, with only minimal efforts. At concealment, chamber pots are emptied by throwing their contents out windows into streets below, creating hazardous conditions for anyone walking outside. The phrase "garde-l'eau," a corruption of the French garde, RLO, meaning watch out for the water, becomes a common warning shouted before dumping waste, though it provides little actual protection from the shower of human excrement that follows. Food preparation and storage create additional health hazards that would horrify modern health inspectors. Meat is butchered and sold in open-air markets where it's exposed to flies, dust, and contamination from countless sources. There's no refrigeration, so spoilage begins immediately, and determining whether meat is safe to eat becomes a matter of desperate guesswork. Bread is often contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, seizures, and a condition called St. Anthony's fire, where extremities become gangrenous and fall off. Kitchens are fire traps where cooking is done over open flames using pots and pans that are rarely cleaned properly. Food poisoning is common and often fatal, especially for children and the elderly whose immune systems can't handle the constant assault of contaminated meals. Stored grain becomes infested with rodents and insects, creating situations where every meal includes a protein supplement of mouse droppings and insect parts, whether you want it or not. The seasonal cycle brings its own particular horrors that modern people can barely imagine. Spring seems like it should be a time of renewal and hope, but it's actually the deadliest season for medieval peasants. This is when food stores are at their lowest, when the previous year's harvest has been consumed but new crops aren't ready. Yet families that have survived winter by rationing their food find themselves facing starvation just as the weather begins to improve. Children who made it through the cold months often die of malnutrition just as warmer weather arrives, their weakened bodies finally succumbing to months of inadequate nutrition. Spring is also when diseases that have been dormant during winter begin to spread rapidly through communities weakened by months of poor diet and close quarters. Epidemic diseases often begin their deadly march through populations during this season, when people's resistance is at its lowest point and social contact increases as communities emerge from winter isolation. Summer brings different challenges, starting with the brutal physical demands of agricultural work during the hottest months of the year. Harvest time is literally a matter of life and death. If crops aren't brought in quickly and efficiently, entire communities face starvation during the coming winter. This creates pressure for impossibly long working days under the scorching sun, leading to heat exhaustion, dehydration, and injuries from hurried work with dangerous tools. The heat also accelerates food spoilage, making it even more difficult to preserve the food that's been grown. Grain storage becomes critical, but without proper techniques, much of the harvest is lost to mold, rodents, and insects. A successful harvest can turn into disaster if storage fails, leaving communities that thought they were prepared facing unexpected hunger. When the food they counted on turns out to be inedible, summer diseases include dysentery and other waterborne illnesses that spread rapidly when contaminated water sources become more concentrated during dry periods. Flies and other insects reach peak populations, spreading disease and making life miserable with constant buzzing, biting, and the knowledge that every insect might be carrying deadly pathogens from the waste piles and rotting matter that litter. Every community. Autumn is supposed to be harvest time, a period of relative plenty, but it's also when communities discover whether they'll survive the coming winter. A failed harvest means certain death for some and probable death for many others. Even successful harvests must be divided among so many competing demands: feudal obligations, church tithes, seed grain for next year's planting, food for immediate consumption that families often realize they don't have enough to last through winter no matter how carefully they ration. This is when the horrible calculations begin. Which family members are most likely to survive and therefore most worth feeding? Which mouths are too expensive to keep alive? How much risk to take in trying to preserve everyone versus ensuring that at least some survive? Elderly family members often voluntarily reduce their food intake or even leave the community during harsh winters, sacrificing themselves so that younger, more productive family members have better chances of survival. Winter completes the cycle of horror with months of cold, darkness, and gradual starvation. Fuel for heating is scarce and expensive, forcing families to choose between staying warm and cooking food. Many people suffer from what we now know as seasonal affective disorder, but in medieval times it's just another unexplained misery that adds to the burden of survival. The short days and long nights create perfect conditions for depression, domestic violence, and social breakdown as communities turn inward and stress levels reach breaking points. This is when diseases like influenza and pneumonia kill the weak and the unlucky. Respiratory infections spread rapidly through communities, where people crowd together for warmth in poorly ventilated spaces. Coughing and sneezing spread germs in confined spaces where everyone breathes the same contaminated air day after day, week after week. But beyond the physical challenges, medieval life includes psychological horrors that are perhaps even worse than the material suffering. The complete lack of hope for improvement creates a mental state that modern people can barely comprehend. You will never travel more than a few miles from where you were born. You will never learn to read or write. You will never have choices about your work, your spouse, your religion, or any other significant aspect of your existence. You will watch most of your children die before reaching adulthood, and you know with certainty that your own life will be short, painful, and meaningless in any larger sense. The knowledge that this suffering isn't temporary, that it's simply the permanent condition of human existence, creates a despair that goes beyond anything most modern people have experienced. There's no social mobility, no possibility of education or self-improvement, no chance that hard work or intelligence will lead to better conditions. You're born into a specific social position and you'll die in that same position, regardless of your talents, efforts, or dreams. This hopelessness is reinforced by a religious system that teaches that suffering on earth is not only inevitable, but actually good for your soul. The church preaches that earthly misery is a test of faith, and that attempts to improve your material conditions might actually endanger your chances of salvation. Accepting your suffering without complaint becomes a religious duty, while trying to escape or improve your situation is presented as sinful pride that could damn you to eternal torture. The social isolation is as crushing as the physical deprivation. Communities are small and insular, but they're also filled with suspicion and competition for scarce resources. Your neighbors might be your only human contact outside your immediate family, but they're also potential threats who might steal your food, seduce your spouse, or accuse you of witchcraft if it serves their interests. Trust is a luxury that can get you killed, but total isolation is also fatal in a world where survival depends on community cooperation. Violence is a constant presence in daily life, not just from official punishments and warfare, but from the routine brutality that emerges when desperate people compete for survival. Domestic violence is accepted as normal. Husbands are expected to beat wives who disobey. Parents regularly use physical punishment that would be considered child abuse today, and disputes between neighbors often escalate to serious violence. With little or no legal intervention, rape is common and rarely punished, especially when the victims are peasant women who have no legal standing or protection. Women who become pregnant from rape face additional dangers during childbirth without support, and children born from rape grow up as outcasts with no legal fathers to provide for them. The vulnerability of women in medieval society is absolute. They have no legal rights, no economic independence, and no recourse when men choose to exploit or abuse them. Children learn early that violence is how problems are solved, and that the strong do whatever they want to the weak. This creates cycles of brutality where each generation grows up more damaged and more willing to inflict suffering on others. The idea that violence might be wrong or that conflicts could be resolved through discussion and compromise simply doesn't exist in most medieval communities. Mental illness, when it's recognized at all, is attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment for sin. People suffering from depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or other psychological conditions are often treated as dangerous criminals or possessed souls who need to be exorcised, beaten, or confined. The treatments are typically worse than the original conditions. Exorcisms involving torture, physical restraints, and forced consumption of disgusting substances meant to drive out evil spirits. The intellectual stagnation is as deadening as the physical suffering. Without education, books, or exposure to new ideas, minds that might have been brilliant in other circumstances simply never develop. Creative and intellectual potential is wasted on a massive scale as entire populations remain ignorant. Not by choice, but because knowledge is deliberately restricted to a tiny elite who use their monopoly on information to maintain power over everyone else. Art, literature, music, and other cultural expressions are limited to religious themes approved by church authorities. Independent thought is not just discouraged but actively dangerous, as questioning established authorities can lead to accusations of heresy, which are often fatal. The human capacity for wonder, creativity, and intellectual growth is suppressed, creating societies where conformity and ignorance are the only safe choices. Yet perhaps the most horrifying aspect of medieval life is how normal it all becomes to the people living it. When everyone you know is malnourished, diseased, and living in filth. These conditions stop seeming exceptional and start seeming like the natural state of human existence. When everyone dies young from preventable causes, early death stops being a tragedy and becomes an expected part of life that people plan around. Children growing up in these conditions don't know that life could be different. They don't dream of better futures because they have no concept that better futures are possible. Their entire worldview is shaped by scarcity, suffering, and early death as the fundamental facts of human existence. Hope itself becomes a foreign concept when experience teaches that things never improve and usually get worse. This normalization of horror extends to practices that would seem unthinkably cruel to modern sensibilities. Public executions are community entertainment where families bring children to watch people being tortured to death. Animal cruelty is casual and constant. Working animals are beaten severely for minor infractions. Pets are rare because food is too scarce to feed animals that don't work. And wildlife is killed for food using methods that maximize suffering because efficiency isn't understood. The treatment of the disabled and elderly reveals the brutal calculus of survival in resource-scarce societies. People who can't work are often abandoned or killed outright because communities literally can't afford to feed unproductive members. Elderly people who become unable to contribute labor are sometimes left to die during harsh winters. Not out of cruelty, but out of the practical recognition that keeping them alive might mean that younger, more productive family members don't survive. Birth defects, injuries, and illnesses that leave people unable to work effectively are often seen as signs of divine displeasure or evidence that the person or their family has committed serious sins. Rather than receiving care and support, disabled individuals often face additional persecution and discrimination on top of their physical challenges. They're excluded from communities, denied food and shelter, and sometimes killed outright as mercy killings that are really about resource conservation. This creates feedback loops where communities become progressively more brutal and less humane. As survival pressures increase, each generation learns to be slightly more callous, slightly more willing to sacrifice others for personal survival, slightly more accepting of cruelty as a normal part of life. Over time, societies that might have started with normal human empathy and compassion evolve into cultures where indifference to suffering becomes a survival skill and mercy becomes a dangerous luxury. The complete absence of privacy means that everyone knows everyone else's business. But this knowledge isn't used for mutual support. It's weaponized for social control and competition. Secrets are impossible to keep, but information is used to gain advantage over neighbors rather than to help them. Communities develop complex systems of gossip, rumor, and surveillance, where people monitor each other, constantly looking for signs of weakness, evidence of rule breaking, or opportunities for personal advancement. This social pressure creates environments where conformity isn't just encouraged, but required for survival. Anyone who stands out, asks questions, or behaves differently becomes a target for suspicion and persecution. Innovation is dangerous because it implies criticism of traditional methods. Questioning authority is fatal because it threatens the power structures that maintain order. Even private thoughts become dangerous if they contradict accepted beliefs, because the lack of privacy means that thoughts have a way of becoming public knowledge. Religious life, rather than providing comfort, becomes another source of fear and oppression. Medieval Christianity emphasizes sin, punishment, and the constant threat of damnation over love, forgiveness, and salvation. Sermons focus on the torments of hell rather than the rewards of heaven, creating religious experiences that are more about terror than inspiration. The Church's political power means that religious conformity isn't just spiritually important. It's essential for physical survival in communities where excommunication means social and economic death. The Church's teachings about sexuality create additional layers of guilt and shame around natural human impulses. Sexual desire is presented as inherently sinful, but marriage and reproduction are required for social stability and economic survival. This creates impossible psychological conflicts where people are taught to feel guilty about desires they can't eliminate and behaviors they can't avoid. The result is a culture of sexual repression mixed with shame that poisons intimate relationships and makes even marriage a source of spiritual anxiety. Women bear the worst of these religious pressures, as they're blamed for male sexual desire and held responsible for maintaining moral purity in communities where such purity is essentially impossible. They're taught that their bodies are inherently sinful and that their primary spiritual duty is to suffer in silence while serving male authority figures. Pregnancy and childbirth, already dangerous and painful, become additional sources of shame and spiritual anxiety as women are taught that these natural processes are punishments for Eve's original sin. The economic system ensures that improvement is impossible for the vast majority of people. Feudalism creates legal structures where peasants are bound to land they can never own, owing labor and products to lords who provide nothing in return except theoretical protection from other lords who might be even worse. Economic mobility is not just rare, it's literally illegal. As peasants cannot leave their assigned positions without permission that's rarely granted. Innovation is actively discouraged because it threatens existing power structures. New agricultural techniques, labor-saving devices, or improved methods of production benefit peasants but reduce the control that lords have over their labor. Therefore, improvements that could reduce suffering and increase prosperity are suppressed to maintain political stability for the ruling class. Progress itself becomes a threat to social order, trade, and commerce, which might provide alternative paths to prosperity, are limited by poor transportation, lack of standardized currency, and constant warfare that makes travel dangerous and unpredictable. Most peasants live in entirely subsistence economies where they produce everything they consume and consume everything they produce, with no surplus available for investment, trade, or improvement. The educational system, controlled entirely by the Church, is designed to produce religious compliance rather than practical knowledge or critical thinking skills. The tiny minority who receive any education learn Latin, theology, and religious law, subjects that have no application to the daily challenges of survival that dominate most people's lives. Practical knowledge about agriculture, medicine, engineering, and other useful subjects is transmitted through oral tradition and apprenticeship. Systems that preserve existing methods without encouraging improvement or innovation. This intellectual isolation means that communities facing problems have no access to solutions that might exist elsewhere. Medical knowledge that could save lives, agricultural techniques that could improve harvests, and social innovations that could reduce conflict are all lost because there are no systems for sharing information across communities. Each village reinvents solutions to common problems, often badly, while better solutions exist just a few miles away in communities they'll never have contact with. The legal system, such as it exists, is designed to maintain existing power structures rather than to provide justice or protection for ordinary people. Laws are created by and for the benefit of the ruling class, with peasants having no input into the rules that govern their lives. Legal proceedings are expensive, conducted in languages peasants don't understand, and presided over by officials who are economically dependent on the same lords who are often the subjects of complaints. This creates situations where legal remedies are worse than the original problems. Seeking justice through official channels often results in additional punishments for the person making complaints, as authorities assume that challenges to their decisions are evidence of dangerous insubordination that needs to be suppressed. People learn to accept injustice and abuse rather than risk the catastrophic consequences that can result from seeking official help. The combination of all these factors, physical suffering, social oppression, intellectual stagnation, economic hopelessness, religious terror, and legal powerlessness, creates lives that are almost incomprehensibly difficult by modern standards. Yet these conditions weren't temporary disasters or unusual circumstances. They were the normal, expected, everyday reality for the vast majority of human beings for centuries. But perhaps the most sobering realization is that the people living these lives didn't experience them as historical curiosities or temporary hardships to be endured until better times arrived. For them, this was simply what human existence was like. They didn't know that alternative ways of living were possible, and they didn't have any reason to believe that conditions might improve. In the future, they lived their entire lives, from birth to early death, within these systems of suffering and oppression, doing their best to find meaning, love, and moments of happiness in circumstances that seemed designed to make such things impossible. They fell in love, raised children, told stories, celebrated festivals, and created art within the constraints of lives that were brutally harsh and cruelly short. They found ways to laugh, to hope, to care for each other, and to maintain their humanity despite living in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Their capacity to find meaning and connection under such circumstances is perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval life, not the suffering they endured, but their ability to remain recognizably human while enduring it. As we return to our modern world of antibiotics and air conditioning, of education and social mobility, of human rights and the reasonable expectation that our children will outlive us, it's worth remembering that the medieval villagers who lived through these horrors were people exactly like us. They had the same capacity for intelligence, creativity, love, and hope that we do. The difference between their lives and ours isn't that they were somehow naturally suited to suffering while we are not. It's that they lived in societies that hadn't yet developed the knowledge, institutions, and technologies that make our comfortable lives possible. Their suffering was not inevitable or natural. It was the result of specific historical circumstances that created systems designed to concentrate wealth and power among a tiny elite, while keeping the majority of the population in conditions of desperate scarcity. Understanding medieval life helps us appreciate not just how much our conditions have improved, but how fragile those improvements are, and how much work it took to create the world we live in today. The horrors of medieval village life remind us that progress is not automatic, that civilization is not guaranteed, and that the freedoms and comforts we take for granted are actually recent innovations that required centuries of struggle to achieve. They were paid for with the suffering of countless generations who lived and died in conditions we can barely imagine, yet who somehow maintained their humanity and laid the groundwork for the world we inhabit today. Consider the psychological resilience required just to wake up each morning knowing that the day ahead would bring hunger, pain, exhaustion, and the constant possibility of death, yet still finding reasons to continue living. Medieval peasants developed coping mechanisms that seem almost superhuman to modern sensibilities, the ability to find joy in the smallest pleasures, to maintain hope despite overwhelming evidence that things would never improve, to love their children fiercely while knowing that most of them would die young. Their relationships with each other were forged in the crucible of shared suffering, creating bonds of loyalty and mutual dependence that were literally matters of life and death. When your survival depends on your neighbor's willingness to help during crises, social connections become more than conveniences. They become essential infrastructure for staying alive. Communities developed elaborate systems of mutual obligation and support that helped them survive disasters that would have killed isolated individuals. Religious faith, despite its oppressive aspects, also provided psychological tools for coping with unbearable circumstances. The promise of eternal reward for earthly suffering gave meaning to lives that might otherwise have seemed pointless. The belief that current hardships were part of a divine plan made it possible to endure conditions that would drive people to despair if they seemed random and meaningless. Prayer, ritual, and religious community provided structure and comfort in lives that were otherwise chaotic and frightening. Even within the constraints of their harsh circumstances, medieval villagers found ways to express creativity and beauty. They carved decorations into wooden tools, embroidered patterns onto rough clothing, told stories that transformed daily struggles into epic adventures, and created music that celebrated both joy and sorrow. Art and creativity weren't luxuries that could only exist in comfortable circumstances. They were essential human needs that found expression even in the most desperate conditions. The seasonal festivals and religious celebrations that punctuated the medieval calendar weren't just superstitious rituals, they were carefully designed psychological relief valves that helped communities survive the grinding monotony and stress of subsistence living. These celebrations provided rare opportunities for abundant food, social bonding, music, dancing, and temporary escape from the daily struggle for survival. They created shared memories of joy and community that sustained people through the dark periods between celebrations. Marriage and family relationships, despite their practical and often brutal aspects, also provided sources of meaning and emotional support that helped people endure unbearable circumstances. The love between spouses, parents, and children, and extended family members created networks of care and mutual support that made survival possible. Even arranged marriages often developed into genuine partnerships as couples learned to depend on each other for physical and emotional survival. Children, despite the high mortality rates and harsh treatment by modern standards, were still sources of hope and joy for their parents. They represented the possibility of continuation, the chance that family lines and communities would survive even if individuals did not. The games children played, the songs they sang, and the stories they were told created brief islands of innocence and wonder in lives otherwise dominated by grim necessity. Work itself, despite being backbreaking and dangerous, provided structure and purpose that helped people make sense of their existence. The agricultural cycle created natural rhythms that connected human activity to larger patterns of seasons and weather. Craftwork allowed individuals to develop skills and create objects that were both useful and beautiful. Even the most humble labor, tending animals, preparing food, maintaining homes, had clear purposes and visible results that provided satisfaction despite the harsh conditions. The knowledge systems that medieval communities developed, while limited by modern standards, represented sophisticated adaptations to their specific environments and circumstances. Peasants possessed detailed understanding of local weather patterns, soil conditions, plant and animal behavior, and seasonal cycles that allowed them to survive in environments that would kill modern people who lack this specialized knowledge. Their oral traditions preserved practical information, moral guidance, and cultural identity across generations without written records. Social hierarchies, despite their oppressive nature, also provided stability and predictability in otherwise chaotic circumstances. Everyone knew their place and their obligations, which reduced social conflict and made cooperation possible even when resources were scarce. The certainty of social position, while limiting, also provided security and identity in ways that might be difficult for modern people to appreciate. Even the harsh punishments and brutal justice systems served functions beyond simple cruelty. They maintained social order in communities where the collapse of cooperation could mean death for everyone. When survival margins are so thin that a single person's failure to contribute could doom the entire group, severe penalties for antisocial behavior become rational survival strategies rather than mere expressions of sadism. The trading relationships that did exist, despite their limitations, created connections between communities that provided both material benefits and psychological relief from isolation. Traveling merchants, wandering craftsmen, and religious pilgrims brought news from other places, different perspectives on common problems, and evidence that the larger world continued to exist beyond the narrow boundaries of village life. Technological innovations, when they occurred, spread slowly but surely through communities that were eager to adopt anything that might reduce suffering or increase survival chances. Better plow designs, improved crop varieties, new preservation techniques, and more effective tools gradually accumulated over generations, creating incremental improvements that made significant differences in people's lives even if they didn't transform their fundamental circumstances. The gradual development of more sophisticated religious and philosophical ideas also provided evolving frameworks for understanding suffering and finding meaning in difficult circumstances. Theological concepts about redemption, salvation, and the value of earthly trials gave intellectual structure to experiences that might otherwise have seemed random and meaningless. But perhaps most importantly, medieval villagers demonstrated the fundamental human capacity to adapt to almost any circumstances while retaining essential humanity. They proved that people can maintain love, loyalty, courage, creativity, and hope even under conditions that seem designed to destroy these qualities. Their example shows that human nature is far more resilient and adaptable than we might imagine. From our comfortable modern perspective, their struggles were not in vain, because they laid the foundation for everything that came after. Every small improvement in agricultural technique, every challenge to unjust authority, every preservation of knowledge through dark times, every act of compassion in brutal circumstances contributed to the slow accumulation of progress that eventually led to better conditions for future generations. The gradual questioning of feudal authority, the slow development of trade and commerce, the patient preservation and copying of ancient texts, the careful observation of natural phenomena, and the persistent demand for justice and dignity all began in medieval villages among people who had every reason to accept their circumstances as unchangeable, but somehow found the courage to imagine that things could be different. When we flip a light switch, visit a doctor, send our children to school, or simply expect to live past 40, we are benefiting from the cumulative efforts of countless medieval villagers who lived in darkness, died of preventable diseases, never learned to read, and rarely saw their 40th birthdays, but who, nonetheless, contributed to the slow progress that made our lives possible. Their legacy is not just the suffering they endured, but the humanity they maintained while enduring it. They remind us that civilization is not a natural state, but an achievement that must be constantly maintained and improved. They show us that progress is possible even under the most unpromising circumstances, but only through the accumulated efforts of people who are willing to struggle for improvements. They may never live to see, as we sit in our climate-controlled homes, scrolling through unlimited information on devices that connect us instantly to the entire world, eating food that has been transported thousands of miles and preserved, using technologies that would seem like magic to medieval villagers. We should remember that all of this is built on the foundation of their struggles. Our comfort exists because they suffered. Our knowledge exists because they preserved what they could. Our freedoms exist because they challenged what they dared. The true horror of medieval village life was not just the physical suffering, but the waste of human potential on such a massive scale. Millions of people who might have been scientists, artists, inventors, writers, or leaders lived and died without ever having the opportunity to develop or express their talents. Their intelligence was wasted on mere survival. Their creativity was channeled into finding new ways to endure suffering. Their leadership abilities were never tested beyond the narrow confines of subsistence agriculture. Yet even this waste was not complete, because the human spirit proved impossible to entirely suppress. Despite everything, some innovation occurred. Some beauty was created, some knowledge was preserved, and some progress was made. The medieval period, for all its horrors, was still a time when human beings continued the slow work of building civilization under almost impossibly difficult circumstances. The villagers we've followed through this journey into medieval horror were not historical curiosities or evolutionary stepping stones. They were our ancestors, genetically and culturally identical to us, who happened to be born into circumstances that made their lives brutally difficult. Understanding their experiences helps us appreciate not just how much our own lives have improved, but how much we owe to their struggles and how much responsibility we bear to continue the work they began. Their ghosts remind us that progress is never guaranteed, that civilizational advances can be lost as well as gained, and that each generation must choose whether to build on the foundation they inherited or allow it to crumble. The comfortable world we inhabit is not the natural state of human existence. It's an artificial creation that requires constant maintenance and improvement to survive. As we turn off our screens and return to our soft beds in our warm, clean homes, perhaps we can spare a moment of gratitude for the countless generations who lived and died in medieval villages, who suffered through conditions we can barely imagine, but who somehow maintained enough hope and humanity to keep civilization alive during its darkest hours. They paid the price for our comfort with their pain, and their only request is that we remember their sacrifice and continue the work they could not finish. The true memorial to medieval suffering is not pity for the dead, but determination among the living to ensure that such conditions never return, and that the progress purchased with so much pain continues toward a future worthy of their sacrifice. Their lives were not wasted if we learn from their experience and build on their foundation. Their suffering was not meaningless if it helps us appreciate the preciousness of the civilization they helped preserve for us. In the end, the horrors of medieval village life teach us not just about the past, but about the present and the future. They remind us that the world we inhabit is not inevitable or permanent, but fragile and precious. They show us that human beings are capable of both extraordinary cruelty and remarkable resilience. They demonstrate that progress is possible, but not automatic, and that civilization is worth fighting for because the alternative is a return to conditions where most human potential is wasted and most human lives are brief and brutal. So the next time you take antibiotics for an infection, attend school to learn skills that interest you, vote for leaders you prefer, travel freely to places you choose to visit, or simply expect to live long enough to see your children reach adulthood, remember the medieval villagers who made none of these things possible for themselves, but whose struggles made all of them possible for us. Their greatest achievement was not what they accomplished in their lifetimes, but what they made possible for future generations who would never know their names, but would inherit the world they helped create. This is their legacy, and our inheritance, the knowledge that human beings can endure almost anything while remaining human. That progress is possible even under the most discouraging circumstances, and that each generation has the responsibility to leave the world a little better than they found it. The medieval villagers fulfilled their part of this contract, despite conditions that would have excused them for giving up entirely. The question that remains is whether we will fulfill ours.